of fires?
Well, an example for you would be that my understanding of the Ash Wednesday fires, and I was a volunteer at the time, there was more people killed on the road evacuating, and certainly as an outcome of that, and I think Alan Rhodes might even be sitting in the room, we did a lot of analytical work which we determined that our concern was that radiant heat was the big killer, so we made a big effort to make sure that people weren't on the roads at those particular times. Of course, the learnings from these fires, I mean, the scientists will come out and give us an outcome of what sort of messaging and where we can go to better inform communities about what they should do.
In the fires that Mr Holloway's just given evidence that in his assessment 70% of the deaths approximately that occurred here occurred from electricity asset failures in some way. In relation to the 69, 77 and 83 fires, the majority of the fires there were electricity asset failures as well. Insofar as those three fires together with this fire have been the fires that have caused the most public deaths, and no other fires caused public deaths of any magnitude in the last 40 years, was there anything done within the system in the planning before the 7th of February to guard against the consequences of electricity assets which have proved to be the major cause of death in fires over the last 40 years?
Goodness me, what a question. I mean, the reality is, consequence for us, our priority in a consequence sense is life, particularly after the 83 fires that you referred to, and the devastating fatalities that occurred there, that we changed our whole process, and Mr Rush alluded to it before, from recovery to preparedness. I think if you look at every major conflagration across the world, whether it's a tsunami, it's not what we as emergency services can do, it is what the communities do to look after themselves and protect themselves. And so we put an enormous amount of effort and energy. We created a community safety department, we had community educators, we had empowered our communities to accept responsibility. We put an enormous amount of effort in, and your question was around consequence, to how do we reduce consequence. And I think one of the learnings for us is the limitations we have as putting wet stuff on red stuff, or a red truck fire type fighting service. We had much more capacity to save lives, and I think that was the question asked before, in informing and educating our community. So in a consequence sense, yes, I think the energy companies themselves became on board. Their access to fire prevention planning processes are at municipalities, and they were obviously very evident that some of their assets had caused fires, and I know they changed regulations, and I was privy to some meetings myself where there was guidelines or code of practices put in place around power lines, etc. Look, it's very difficult for me to answer that question unprepared, but I am well and truly aware there was a significant amount of effort done by both our agencies, by the power companies and that, to reduce consequence as a result of these type of fires.
Well, insofar as the 4 major death fires in this state where the public's involved have involved power assets being the cause of the majority of those deaths, was there anything done differently in 2009 compared to earlier times to guard against these power assets causing deaths?
Well, Chairman, that question is almost unanswerable. From the witness box, 3 fires have been referred to going back to the 1960s. It's just a task to set for the witness.
Well, if I may put it to you're aware of each of those fires, as the 69, the 77 and 83 fires as being the major death-causing fires to the public in the state of Victoria before the 12th of before the 7th of February.
It's certainly not a detail that I was aware of until you've mentioned it, but I take you on your word. I'm not challenging that at all. I will accept it.
And to the extent that you and your organisation has training and looks at the history, is somebody charged with reviewing that history to try and stop it occurring?
Well, we work pretty closely, and again, I find the question difficult to answer because I'm not privy to it, but I can tell you from my experience. I mean, I've even during my role as Manager Community Safety, which you'll see in my statement, I worked directly with United Energy where we specifically went out and looked at power poles. We had a pre-season power pole, and it was It's an interesting job, I'll put it that way. But we inspected significant power poles. They changed regulations. We worked with that industry to make sure that there was, those risks were mitigated as best as possible. Can I answer the question to every specific detail of what's occurred in partnership with the power industries, etc.? No, I can't. But, our charter as an organisation under the legislation to save life and property, and irrespective of whether it's a power industry start or whether it's a Mother Nature lightning start or some person that we don't particularly like starting a fire, our job is to both extinguish the fire and prepare communities. And without repeating myself, I think you've heard my views on that.
Has there anything arisen out of these fires as far as your reviewing of them that could give the community a expectation that the future fires won't have such a level of destruction caused by power asset failures? Well, when they've traditionally been the cause of the fires.
My argument to you, my response to you would be to say our energies are not about. Obviously, we need to know the causes, and we will continue to work with those utilities to make sure the causes. A lot of our learnings are about, irrespective of what caused the fire, about when we need to. Blind Freddie will tell you, we need to improve the way we inform communities, both in speed and accuracy. We need to get better on the way we manage fires. I mean, we continue to learn from these experiences, and we'll continue to do so.
Has there been anything specifically done about power?
Off the top of my head, I can't answer your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No questions.
Mr. Warrington.
Some of those questions where I might have just one or two answers in response. I'll be very brief. Mr. Warrington, you were asked some questions about numbers of deaths caused by assets and electricity assets in particular as a result of fires. No evidential foundation has been put in relation to those, but I take it you don't really have any expertise in relation to numbers of death caused by fires?
No, well, not specifically, no.
Or knowledge.
I mean, I know, the amount of people that died in our major fires. There's no doubt about that. But go on. Yeah.
And no particular knowledge about the causes in terms of electricity assets, for example, of deaths in the 1969, 77 and 83 fires.
Well, other than my study of the history of it, is that there was a number of private assets, particularly in 83, where private power lines coming off the main power lines fell, and they weren't properly maintained. And my understanding is the energy companies maintained their power lines to a degree, but where they came off into private property, they weren't maintained. They fell, they caused fires. And we're obviously aware that high wind events, and particularly with the history with expansion and contraction of power lines, yes, I'm aware of the broad history of the power industry being involved in fire starts, if you like. And
your knowledge, I take it from the previous answer, is really about privately owned assets and their causal connection with fires in the past.
Well, so that was because, and I say that because part of the working with the industry that I was involved was to bring up a code of practice for privately owned code of practice. I think it was, off the top of my head, for privately owned power lines and so on and so forth. So yes, but I'm aware that it's not just privately owned power lines that cause us fire starts.
Yes. I take it from your answers to some of Mr. Tobin's questions that you have some experience in working with utility companies, energy companies, in relation to improving fire outcomes and.
Very definitely. Yes. Yeah, we do partnerships with whoever we can to mitigate risk within the state. Yeah.
And has your experience with those sorts of activities been predominantly a positive one in relation to cooperation with utility companies?
If you're asking me, is there intent to prevent fires occurring, then most definitely. I don't think any of us, including the power industry, wants to have products or assets that start fires. And their intent, even inviting us along, I think was a goodwill, if not a legitimate exercise in forming a partnership to try and mitigate that risk.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Warrington. Thank you, Mr.
I have no other matters. May Mr. Warrington be excused.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Warrington. You are excused.
Thank you.
Commissioners will have an early finish as I only have 2 housekeeping matters to deal with. We did intend to call on Mr Thomas Mark Glover. He's unwell and we don't require his attendance and nobody requires him for cross-examination. So in light of that, I seek to simply tender his statement. There's not a need to bring it up, but just for the record, I'll identify it. It's his statement dated 28 August, WIT stop 3004, stop 001, stop 0260. His evidence is relevant for this purpose. He is the operations manager and manager of CAD, namely Computer Aided Dispatch System for the CFA, and in particular he occupied the position of night shift state duty officer at the IECC on the evening of the 7th. His statement is detailed and in all relevant respects speaks for itself, so I simply seek to tender that.
He seems to be an extraordinarily detailed log keeper.
Yes. So I simply tender that.
Exhibit 220.
The Commission pleases. One other matter, I've been asked to correct one figure given in the opening by Mr Rosen this morning. He inadvertently referred to 112 deaths in houses in terms of the body of deaths with which we will now deal. The correct number is 113. As a result of a media inquiry, I just wanted to correct that. Otherwise, we have no other witnesses until 2 p.m, so it may be appropriate to break early.
Yes, well, adjourned to